The photograph was of me. I knew it the way you know your own hands in the dark. Not by looking, but by some older sense that doesn't need proof. A baby with a blotchy red face wrapped in what might have been a curtain held against someone's chest. The chest was cut off by the edge of the frame, no face above it. Just arms, a collarbone, the corner of a jaw, and behind that, through a window, something green. Trees. Land. I hadn't seen land in 16 years. They pulled the man from the water at false dawn, when the sky was the color of a wet knife. I was on gutter duty, clearing the drainage channels between the deck plates on the grayling, the old research vessel that serves as the flotilla's spine. It's the kind of work nobody fights over. Hunched on your knees, dragging fish bones and salt crust out of the seams with a bent piece of wire, your back aching before the sun even shows. I liked it. The rhythm, the privacy. On the grayling's foredeck, you could be alone in a way that almost didn't exist anymore, because everyone else was asleep or on watch at the flotilla's edges, and the dead that occasionally bumped against the hulls at waterline were slow enough in cold ocean that you could hear them coming. That thick, patient scraping, like a dog trying to dig under a fence. I'm telling this wrong. Let me go back. My name, the name they gave me on the flotilla, is Wren. I don't speak. I haven't spoken since before memory, or at least that's what everyone on the flotilla believes, and what I believed too until 7 days ago. I communicate with my hands, a system of signs that Maura developed when I was small enough to carry, adapted from something she half remembered from before the turn. It works for most things. For complicated things, I use a wax board and a nail. For the rest, I just point, or don't bother. I'm 17. Maybe. Maura says I was about a year old when she found me, and the turn happened 22 years before that according to the flotilla's reckoning, which means the turn is 39 years gone, which means I was born into a world where the dead had already been walking for over 2 decades. I have no memory of anything solid underfoot that wasn't a deck. The sea is not my home. It's just the only floor I've known. The flotilla is 11 vessels lashed together with cable, chain, and hope. The grayling in the center. 140 feet of rusted oceanographic research ship that someone kept running on biodiesel and fury. Around it, like barnacles with ambition, 2 fishing trawlers, a sailing catamaran, a Coast Guard cutter with a dead engine that we use for storage, 3 houseboats of varying integrity, a steel-hulled ketch, and 2 pontoon platforms built from oil drums and timber that serve as our farms, hydroponics, rainwater collection, kelp lines, 61 people, last count. We drift. The ocean takes us where it wants, and we correct when we can, staying in the northern Pacific current loop, because that's where the fish are, and because the dead are slower in colder water. We avoid land. Land is where the dead are thick, where the living are worse, where the old world sits like a broken tooth you can't stop tonguing. That's the founding story. That's what the children, what I, grew up hearing. Maura tells it every year at the binding, the anniversary of when the flotilla first lashed together. We fled the land because the land was death. The sea saved us. We are the sea's people now. The old world is gone. There is nothing left on the shore worth dying for. I believed it the way I believed the tide. Not as opinion. As physics. Then they pulled the man from the water, and he had my face in his pocket, and the land in the photograph was green. He was half dead himself. Not turned. You can tell by the eyes, and by the smell, and by the way they move. The turned don't shiver. This man shivered so hard his teeth sounded like a rattle. Fenn spotted him first from the watch platform on the catamaran's mast. A shape in the water, arms moving wrong, like someone trying to swim who'd forgotten the motions halfway through. Fenn called it down. Oren, who runs the catamaran, and therefore controls what its crew does, made the decision to pull the stranger aboard. This was not guaranteed. We've passed floating people before, most are dead, some are alive but too far gone. Once, when I was 11, we pulled a woman from a drifting lifeboat and she turned within an hour. The bite hidden under her sleeve, the fever already cooking her brain from the inside. Oren lost a finger that day. He still picks up strangers. I've never understood why. This one didn't bite. He coughed salt water until I thought his lungs would come up in pieces, and then he went still, breathing in fast, shallow sips, and his hand was clenched around something so tight that when Maura tried to open his fingers to check for wounds, he groaned like she was pulling nails from a board. The photograph, laminated, waterlogged at the edges but preserved in the center by whatever cheap plastic someone had sealed it in years ago. A Polaroid, maybe, or something printed small. The colors faded to that blue-orange palette that old photographs fall into, like the world used to be lit differently. And on the back, in handwriting so careful, it looked like someone had used a ruler to keep the letters straight. 5 words. Ren, born Astoria. She lives. Maura read it. Then she looked at me, and her face did something I'd never seen before. Not fear, not surprise, but something architectural, like a wall shifting on its foundation. She put the photograph in her coat and told me to go back to gutter duty. I didn't go back to gutter duty. I went to the gap between the Grayling's engine housing and the starboard trawler, the place I go when I need to not be findable. It's a space about 3 feet wide where the hulls almost touch, and you can sit on a crossbeam with your legs hanging over the water and feel the flotilla breathe, the creak of lines, the suck and slap of waves in the gap, the distant murmur of the hydroponics pump on the port platform. The dead sometimes drift underneath. You can see their shapes in the water if the light is right. Pale forms turning slowly in the current, mouths working at nothing. They don't scare me. They've been down there my whole life, they're furniture. What scared me was Maura's face. Maura raised me, not as a mother. She'd say that herself flatly if you asked. As a keeper. She found me, she says, during the flotilla's early days, floating in a sealed cooler that someone had punched air holes into and set adrift. A baby in a box on the ocean. The cooler was from a bait shop. The label was still on the side. She kept it for years, showed it to me when I was old enough to understand. Here, this is where you came from. Isn't that something? A bait cooler. And I'd touch the cracked plastic and try to feel something about it and come up empty. Maura is 63, thick hands, thick shoulders, a face like a coast that's taken weather for decades and doesn't apologize for the erosion. She was a diesel mechanic before the turn, one of the few people on the flotilla who remembers the before world clearly and will talk about it if you catch her on the right night, if the kelp wine is flowing, if someone's playing the guitar fen-made from a fuel can. She'd talk about traffic, grocery stores, the sound a washing machine made. She'd describe these things with such tenderness that even I, who had no framework for them, could feel the loss radiating off her like heat from a stove. She never talked about where she found me. I mean, she'd tell the story of the cooler, the air holes, the bait shop label, but she never talked about where on the water, or when exactly, or why someone would put a baby in a box and push it out to sea. When I'd ask, signing the question carefully, repeating it, she'd get that look, the architectural look, and she'd say, "Doesn't matter where. Matters that you're here." I was 15 when I stopped asking. Now I sat in the gap between the hulls, 17 and vibrating with something I couldn't name, watching a dead woman drift by underneath with kelp in her hair, and I thought about the word on the back of that photograph. My name. Not Ren. That's the flotilla name, the one Maura gave me because I was small and loud as an infant, she said, before I went quiet. The other thing. The place. Astoria. I knew what it was. We all did, loosely. The flotilla's children learned geography from Oren's charts, hand-corrected nautical maps that he maintains with religious devotion, updating coastlines based on drift patterns, marking dead zones and wreck fields and places where the current carries too many turn to be safe. Astoria was on the charts. Oregon coast, the mouth of the Columbia River. A town, or what used to be one. Oren had drawn a small red X beside it years ago, the same mark he put next to every coastal settlement. Confirmed dead zone. Do not approach. She lives. The stranger stayed unconscious through that first day. They moved him to the cutter. Our sick bay, more or less, because it has the most enclosed space and the thickest walls, in case someone turns. Fen sat with him. Fen always sits with the sick ones because Fen, who is 24 and remembers nothing of the old world either, has this stubborn belief that no one should be alone while suffering. It's impractical and generous, and it's why I've followed Fen around since I was 9 years old, with an intensity I've never fully examined. I couldn't ask Maura about the photograph. Not yet. She'd shut the door on it, and I could feel the lock from across the flotilla, that particular silence she generates when a topic is sealed. So I went to the only other person who might know something, which was Oren. Oren is the flotilla's memory. He's 71, thin as rope, with hands so sun-damaged they look like they're made of leather someone left out in the rain. He runs the catamaran because it's the fastest vessel, and he refuses to be anywhere he can't leave quickly. He keeps the charts, the log, the weather records, the census of every person who's lived and died on the flotilla since its founding. He knew the old world. He navigated the flotilla out of Puget Sound during the first years, when the dead were still fresh enough to be fast and the living was still panicked enough to be lethal. He doesn't talk about that time. Nobody who was there does, except at the binding, and then only the approved version. I found him on the catamaran's foredeck, sewing a torn sail with a needle made from a fishbone and thread made from kelp fibre. I knelt beside him and signed, "The man from the water." He had a photograph. Oren didn't look up. Maura told me. It was me, in the photograph. Maura told me that too. Astoria, on the back. What's in Astoria? He did look up then. His eyes are the pale blue of deep water on an overcast day, almost colourless, almost transparent, like something that's been bleached by decades of staring at the horizon. He held my gaze for a long time. Then he said, "Same thing that's everywhere on land. Nothing worth going back for." His hands were shaking. Not from age. I know what his age tremor looks like. This was different. This was the tremor of a man trying to hold something still inside himself. "You're lying," I signed. "Probably," he said, and went back to sewing. The stranger woke on the second day. I wasn't supposed to be there. Maura had made that clear with a look that could have cut cable. Stay away from the cutter, stay away from the stranger, go do your work. But the flotilla is small enough that stay away is mostly theoretical, and I'd spent 16 years learning how to be in places without being noticed. I am 5'2". I weigh maybe 110 pounds. My feet are bare and calloused hard enough that I can walk on rusted steel without flinching. I don't make noise. I am, in many ways, perfectly designed for eavesdropping, which is the only real advantage of being the quiet one in a community that forgets you're listening. I was in the cutter's forward compartment, on the other side of the bulkhead from where the stranger lay, my ear pressed to the metal. Fen was with him. I could hear Fen's voice, that particular low, patient frequency Fen uses for the hurt. And then a new voice, the stranger's, ragged and breaking like a wave on rock. "Been looking? 3 years. 3 years on the coast. Fen, looking for what?" "For you, the flotilla. We heard you on the radio years back, a transmission, someone said. Someone said there was a child. From Astoria. Silence. Then Fen. I don't know anything about that. Her name is Wren. She'd be 17 now. Is she here? Is she alive? I pressed my hands flat against the bulkhead to keep them from shaking. The metal was cold and damp, and I could feel the vibration of the ocean through it, that constant low hum that is the flotilla's heartbeat. Fen said carefully, "There's a girl named Wren. She doesn't speak." The sound the stranger made was not a word. It was something from below language, from the place where sound is just pressure and grief. Then he said, "She spoke. She spoke when she was a baby. She said mama, she said more, He started coughing again, the deep, wet cough of lungs that had taken on too much ocean. When it passed, his breathing was worse, thinner. I could hear the whistle in it from through the wall. Fen said, "You need to rest. I need to see her. Please, tell Mora. Tell Mora I know. Tell her I know about the meridian." The meridian. The word landed in me like a hook. Not because I recognized it. I didn't, not consciously. But because of what it did to the air on the other side of the bulkhead. The silence that followed was so total I could hear Fen's breathing stop. Then Fen said very quietly, "I'll get Mora." I moved. Fast, silent, out through the cutter's forward hatch and across the deck and into the gap between hulls before Fen emerged. I sat on my crossbeam and watched the water and tried to make the word mean something. Meridian. It wasn't in any of Oren's charts that I'd seen. It wasn't part of the binding story. It was a hole in the flotilla's history shaped exactly like a secret. Mora went into the cutter. She was in there for 40 minutes. When she came out, her face was closed in that architectural way, but worse, like the wall hadn't just shifted but was actively being braced against collapse. She went straight to Oren's catamaran. They talked on the foredeck with their backs to the flotilla, voices too low to carry. I couldn't lip-read from that distance, but I could watch their bodies. Mora's shoulders climbing towards her ears. Oren's hands stopping their work and going still, which never happened. Oren's hands were always moving. Stillness in Oren meant emergency. That night I went to Fen. Fen sleeps on the catamaran's deck when the weather's mild, in a sleeping bag that's been patched so many times it's more patch than bag. I found Fen awake, staring up at the stars, which were sharp and cold and closed the way they get only on the open ocean, where there's no light to compete with. I sat beside Fen and signed, "What's the meridian?" Fen turned to look at me. In the starlight, Fen's face was all angles and shadow. The broken nose from a rigging accident 3 years ago, the scar across the chin from a fishhook, the dark eyes that always seemed to be running calculations about kindness, figuring out the most efficient route to decency. "I don't know," Fen said. "Wren, I actually don't know. But when he said it, I felt like I should, like the word was sitting in a room in my head that someone locked a long time ago. He said he's been looking for 3 years. For me, for the flotilla." Fen was quiet for a while. Then, "Mora's scared." "I know. Not for you scared, of you scared. There's a difference." I felt that land in my chest. Of me. Mora, who had carried me, fed me, taught me to sign, sewn my clothes, held my hair back when I was sick over the side of the grayling. Mora was afraid of me. Or afraid of what I was becoming now that the stranger had arrived, with my face in his pocket, and a word that made the founding story shake. "What do I do?" I signed. Fen reached out and put a hand on my forearm. Warm. Rough-skinned. Present. "You do what you always do. You watch. You listen. You wait for the pattern." A pause. And then you decide if the pattern is worth breaking. I went to my bunk on the grayling and lay in the dark and listened to the flotilla creak and settle around me, 61 people breathing in their sleep, and below them the patient dead, and below the dead the ocean that didn't care about any of us. And I thought, Astoria. She lives. The Meridian. And I thought, who am I? If Mora's story isn't true. The stranger's name was Colum. He told me that himself, on the third day when I finally went into the cutter alone. He was worse. Even I could see it. The grey tone under his sunburn, the way his breathing had turned into a project, each inhale requiring visible effort, like someone pumping a bellows with a crack in it. Exposure, Mora had said when someone asked. Dehydration, time in the water. But I'd seen exposure before. I'd seen people pulled from the ocean and recover in 2 days, up and walking, hungry and grateful. Colum wasn't recovering. He was dimming. He lay on the cot in the cutter's main cabin, wrapped in every blanket we could spare, and when I came through the hatch he turned his head and looked at me, and I watched something move across his face that I'd never seen directed at me before. Recognition. Not the way Mora looked at me, which was ownership and worry. Not the way Fen looked at me, which was friendship and something adjacent to it. This was the look of someone seeing a thing they'd spent years trying to find. Ren, he said. His voice sounded like it was being filtered through gravel and water. I nodded. You look like her. Your mother, the jaw, the way you hold your head, like you're always listening for something. I pulled out my waxboard, scratched with the nail. Who are you? He smiled, or tried to. Nobody important. A messenger. I was. Before, I was a middle school science teacher. Can you believe that? Taught 6th graders about photosynthesis. Now I'm a messenger for a dead woman who wanted you to know the truth. My mother. He was talking about my mother. What truth? He closed his eyes. The effort of speaking was costing him something visible, each word depleting a reserve that wasn't being replenished. The Meridian was a ship, a research vessel, bigger than the Grayling. It was the first vessel in the flotilla, the original. 23 years ago, before any of this, he gestured weakly at the walls of the cutter, at the flotilla beyond. The Meridian left Astoria with 40 people. Your mother organized it. She was a harbor pilot. She knew the water. She knew the coast was falling, and she convinced 40 people to take the Meridian out into the Pacific and survive. I stared at him. My hand had stopped moving. The waxboard sat in my lap with its incomplete question, and I couldn't finish it because I was recalculating everything. The founding story, Mora's story, the binding story, the story that every child on the flotilla grew up inside like a house, said that the flotilla formed organically, survivors finding each other on the water. No plan, no leader, no origin point. Just the sea gathering the living the way a tide gathers shells. It wasn't random, Colum said, reading my face. The Meridian was the seed. Your mother planned it, supplied it, chose the people. She, another coughing fit. Longer this time. When it passed, there was pink in the corners of his mouth. She had a list. Skills they'd need. Diesel mechanics. Fishermen. A doctor. A navigator. She picked Mora. She picked Oren. Mora. Oren. Chosen. Not survivors who'd found each other by accident on a merciless ocean, but recruits. Selected by a woman with a plan. My mother. Where is the Meridian now? Sunk. 2 years after launch. Storm. Your mother went down with it. She stayed aboard to keep the engine running, while the others transferred to the Grayling and the trawlers. By then you were already on the flotilla. She'd had you on the water, born on the Meridian. The first child of the flotilla. He said this with a terrible tenderness, like he was placing each fact in front of me the way you'd place stones across a stream, trying to build a crossing. After the Meridian sank, Mora and Oren rebuilt. They lashed the remaining vessels together. They wrote a new story. No single leader, no planned origin, no Meridian. Because if the flotilla had a founder, it had a hierarchy. If it had a hierarchy, it would have power struggles. They decided the safest lie was no founder at all. Just the sea, gathering the living. I sat with this. Below us, something scraped along the cutter's hull. A dead hand, maybe, or just a piece of debris. The sound was so familiar it was almost comforting. The dead doing what they do, scraping at the edges of the living, patient, ambient, barely worth noticing anymore. Why does it matter now? I wrote. Because your mother didn't just plan the flotilla. She left something, in Astoria, a cache, supplies, medicine, seeds, real seeds, wren, terrestrial crop seeds in sealed containers, equipment, plans, everything you'd need to go back to land. He paused. She called it the return. She always meant for you to go back. The flotilla was supposed to be temporary. 30 years on the water while the dead slowed down, rotted out, burned through their bodies. And then the return. Back to Astoria. Back to solid ground. The idea was so enormous I couldn't hold it. Land. Not as a red X on Oren's charts, not as a death zone glimpsed on the horizon like a bad memory, but as a destination. As home. Mora knows, I wrote, though I already knew the answer. Mora's known the whole time. She decided the return was too dangerous, that the dead on land were still too thick, the living settlements too violent. She chose the sea. She chose to keep you here, keep everyone here, and let the cache rot. His breathing hitched. The pink at his mouth was darker now. Your mother, before the meridian went down, she gave me the photograph, told me to find you if Mora hadn't done the return by the time you were grown. Took me a lot longer than she planned. He reached out and gripped my wrist. His hand was burning, fever hot, tight with the desperate strength of someone holding onto consciousness by will alone. You have to decide, Ren. There are 61 people on this flotilla who don't know they were supposed to go home. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bunk on the grayling and stared at the riveted ceiling 3 feet above my face and felt the flotilla rock beneath me and tried to rebuild the world inside my head. The founding story was a lie, not a small lie, not a wrong date or a misremembered name, but a structural lie, a lie that was the foundation under everything, under who we were, under why we were on the water, under the entire culture of the flotilla, which was built on the idea that we had no past, no plan, no purpose except survival. We were sea people. We'd always been sea people. The land had nothing for us. Except it did. A cache, seeds, medicine, the means to return. And Mora. Mora, who raised me, who taught me the signs for safe and danger and home. Mora had decided for all of us that we would never go back. I tried to be angry. I wanted the clean fuel of rage, something to burn, something to move on. But what came instead was something more complicated. A grief that folded in on itself, because the woman who had loved me and lied to me had done both for the same reason. She was afraid. Not of the dead. Of the chance that the return would fail, that people would die on land, that the flotilla would fracture and scatter, and the careful, fragile thing she'd spent 20 years maintaining would break apart on some rocky Oregon shore. I understood that. I hated that I understood it. In the morning, I went to Mora. She was on the grayling's stern, working the biodiesel processor, a nightmare contraption of tubes and tanks that converts fish oil into something the grayling's engine can burn roughly. She was elbow-deep in grease, and she didn't look up when I approached, which was how I knew she'd been expecting me. I waited until she paused. Then I signed. I talked to him. I know. He told me about the meridian. Mora pulled her arms out of the processor and wiped them on a rag that was dirtier than her arms. She looked at me. The architectural face was gone. What was underneath was older and more tired than I'd ever seen. Your mother, Mora said slowly, was the bravest person I ever met, and the most reckless. She had a plan for everything. The meridian, the flotilla, the cash, the return, every detail, every contingency, except the one where things go wrong and people die. She dropped the rag. When the meridian sank, I was holding you. You were screaming. Your mother was in the engine room with water up to her chest, keeping the pumps running so we had time to get the last people off. She made me promise to take care of you. She didn't make me promise to do the return. But she wanted it. She wanted a lot of things. She wanted to save the world. Some of us just wanted to keep breathing. 61 people don't know. 61 people are alive. Mora's voice hardened. The tenderness calcified. They're alive because I kept us on the water, away from the shore, away from the settlements that turned into warlord camps, away from the dead zones, away from every beautiful idea that gets people killed. Your mother's cash might be there, or it might have been looted 20 years ago, or flooded, or burned. It doesn't matter. What matters is we're here. I signed the next thing very carefully, very slowly, so she couldn't pretend to misread it. You don't get to decide that for everyone. Mora stared at me. Then she said something she'd never said before, in a voice I didn't recognize. You sound like her. And she walked away. The confession cascade started that afternoon. Not because I triggered it, because Colm did in his fever talking to Fen. He couldn't keep the story contained. It leaked out of him in fragments. The meridian, the founder, the cash, the return. Fen heard it and came to me with wide eyes and hands that moved too fast, signing questions I couldn't answer. And then Fen told Dag. Dag is the flotilla's closest thing to a doctor, a former veterinary technician who'd been born on one of the trawlers and learned medicine from whatever textbooks the flotilla had salvaged. Dag is 30, meticulous, humorless in a way that makes their rare jokes devastating, and possessed of a memory that borders on compulsive. Dag keeps records. Dag writes everything down. When Fen told Dag about the meridian, Dag went to the log, Oren's log, the official record of the flotilla, and started comparing dates. It took Dag 4 hours to find the gap. The first 3 years are missing, Dag told me that evening, in the cutter while Colm slept fitfully on the cot between us. Oren's log starts in year 4. There's a note, prior records lost in transit. But nothing was lost in transit. I've inventoried every item on the cutter twice. The early records aren't lost, they were removed. Dag looked at me with those careful, cataloguing eyes. What else don't we know? And that was when I understood what was happening. The lie was a single timber in a structure, and Colm had pulled it. And now the building was shifting. Each person who learned the truth became a vector. Each conversation spread the fracture. By nightfall, 4 people knew. Me, Fen, Dag, and Colm. By the following morning, Fen had told 3 others while helping with the kelp harvest, unable to carry the weight alone. By the afternoon of the 5th day, half the flotilla was whispering. And the whisper had a shape, and the shape was a question. Were we supposed to go home? Colm was dying. Dag told me on the 5th night, standing outside the cutter in the salt wind, arms crossed, voice flat in the way that medical people go flat when they're delivering news they can't fix. Pneumonia. Advanced, both lungs, from what I can hear. I don't have antibiotics. I don't have imaging. I don't have oxygen supplementation. I have willow bark tea and clean water and a man who spent too long in the Pacific Ocean. Dag paused. He might have a week. Probably less. I pressed my palms together. The sign for understood. But I didn't understand. Not really. Colm had crossed the ocean carrying my photograph and my mother's plan, and now he was dissolving in the cutter's cabin, and there wasn't enough time. There was never enough time. That's the only lesson the flotilla teaches that's actually true. The flotilla was fracturing, not violently. We weren't that kind of community, but in the quieter, more permanent way that happens when trust breaks. People clustered in groups on different vessels and fell silent when others approached. The kelp harvest slowed because the harvest teams were reorganizing themselves along lines of loyalty. Those who felt betrayed by the lie, those who supported Mora's decision, and a smaller, more dangerous group who simply wanted the cash regardless of any principle. Mora stopped speaking to me, not with anger, with something worse. Distance. She went about her work on the biodiesel processor. She maintained the Grayling's engine. She ate her meals in the engine room, instead of on the communal deck. She was retreating into the machine, into the purely mechanical, where lies and founding stories and the ghosts of drowned women didn't reach. Oren surprised me. On the 6th day, he came to find me in my gap between the hulls, which almost nobody knew about, which meant he'd been watching me long enough to learn my patterns. He lowered himself onto the crossbeam beside me with the careful economy of a 71-year-old body that can't afford to waste a movement, and he sat there for a while, looking at the water. "Your mother's name was Lena," he said finally. "Lena Vasquez. She was 34 when the Meridian went down. She'd been a harbour pilot in Astoria for 6 years before the turn, and before that she'd been in the Coast Guard." He paused. She was better than all of us. And Mora. Mora was her best friend. Not just a recruit. Her best friend from before the turn. They grew up together, went to school together. Mora was the maid of honor at Lena's wedding. He said this while looking at the dead shapes drifting under the hulls. A man. A woman. Something too degraded to tell. The current carried them slowly past, turning them like logs in a river. After the Meridian, Mora broke. Not in a way you could see from the outside. She kept working, kept the engine running, kept feeding you. But she couldn't carry Lena's plan anymore. The return was Lena's. Every part of it had Lena's fingerprints on it, and touching it was like touching a wound that wouldn't close. So she buried it, rewrote the story, told herself and everyone else that the sea was all there was. "You helped her bury it," I signed. I did. No hesitation, no shame, just admission, clean as a bone. I agreed with her not because I thought Lena was wrong, but because I was afraid Lena was right. That there was a way back, that we'd try it and fail, that I'd navigate us to shore and watch people die on land on solid ground after keeping them alive on the water for years. He turned to look at me. "Fear's a terrible foundation for a decision, Ren. But it's honest. Is the cash real? I don't know. It was real 22 years ago, whether it survived, weather, looters, the dead, time. I genuinely don't know." He rubbed his face with both hands. "But I know where Lena put it. I have the coordinates in my head. I've had them for 22 years, like a splinter I couldn't extract." Below us, one of the dead bumped against the hull. The soft, thick sound of waterlogged flesh on steel. I barely registered it. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the stranger is dying, and when he dies, the photograph and the story go with him, unless someone decides they're worth keeping. And because you deserve to choose. Not Mora, not me. You." He stood slowly, joints audible. "Your mother built this flotilla for you, not as a home, as a lifeboat, and lifeboats are supposed to reach shore eventually." He left me on the crossbeam, with the dead drifting underneath and the stars coming on overhead, and the weight of a choice I hadn't asked for settling onto my shoulders like a wet sail. That night, the flotilla held what Darg would later call a reckoning. It wasn't planned. It grew the way things grow on the water, organically, inevitably, the way a storm builds from a shift in pressure that you feel in your sinuses before you see it in the sky. People gathered on the Grayling's main deck. All 61 of us, minus Column, who was unconscious in the cutter. Mora was there, standing near the engine housing with her arms crossed and her face locked. Oren was there, on the periphery, watching from the catamaran's rail. People talked. Not in any order, just the way a group talks when the thing everyone's been whispering about finally hits the air. Some were angry, some were afraid. Some wanted the cash. Some wanted to stay on the water, which was the only world they knew. A woman named Suki, who'd been born on one of the houseboats and had never set foot on land in her life, stood up and said, "You're asking me to walk on dirt. I don't know what dirt feels like. I don't know what a tree sounds like up close. You're asking me to be a stranger in a place I've never been, and you're calling it home?" And someone else said, "It's not about the dirt. It's about the lie." And someone else said, "The lie kept us alive." And around, the flotilla talking to itself like a body arguing with its own immune system, and Mora silent through all of it, and me silent too. But my silence was different from hers. Hers was defensive. Mine was the silence of someone who hasn't decided what to say yet and knows that when she speaks, it will matter. Colm died on the 8th day. I was with him. Fen was with him. Dag was there, doing what Dag could do, which by then was nothing except monitor the breathing as it thinned and hitched and rattled towards the inevitable. Colm's lungs were full. You could hear it, a wet, subterranean sound, like water running through a cave, getting louder as the cave got smaller. He'd been unconscious for most of the previous day, his skin the colour of old sailcloth. His hands twitching on the blanket like they were still trying to swim. He came back briefly near the end. His eyes opened and they found me with that recognition again, that look of completed search. And he said, "You're so much taller than I imagined." I held his hand. It was the thing I could do. His grip had no strength left in it, so I squeezed for both of us, and I felt the bones of his fingers like sticks in a thin glove. And I thought about how he'd carried a photograph across years of coastline, through dead zones and ruins and whatever horrors the shore contained, because a woman he'd apparently known had asked him to deliver a message to her daughter. "The cash," he whispered. "East Side, warehouse, the harbour pilot's office." Lena sealed it. Concrete and... A cough. The worst yet. When it passed, his lips were dark. Tell them she built the road home and all they have to do is walk it." His eyes closed. His breathing became the sound of the sea coming through a crack in a hull. Persistent, then intermittent, then gone. Fen made a sound. Small, involuntary, a grief that escaped before it could be caught. Dag stood up, checked the pulse out of professional habit, and said, "He's gone." Then Dag went to the hatch, opened it to the salt air, and stood there with their back to us, breathing. I sat with Colm's hand in mine, and felt the warmth leave it by degrees. This is something they don't tell you about death on the flotilla. The body cools faster than you expect. The ocean takes the heat. Through the cot, through the hull, into the water, gone. Within an hour he'd feel like the metal he was lying on. We wrapped him in canvas. The flotilla's tradition is burial at sea. Weighted, sewn closed, slipped off the stern into the deep water where the dead don't walk because there's no bottom to stand on. But before we wrapped him, I went through his clothes. His pockets. I found the photograph. They'd given it back to him after Mora took it initially, a concession to his delirium. I found a folding knife with a wooden handle, worn smooth by years of grip. I found 3 waterproof matchboxes, empty. I found in the lining of his jacket where he'd sewn it in like a secret, a piece of paper, a map, hand-drawn, in ink that had survived the ocean because the paper was waxed. Someone had rubbed candle wax into both sides, a preservation technique I'd seen Oren use on his charts. The map showed a coastline, a river mouth, a town grid, simplified but recognizable if you knew what Astoria had looked like. And on the east side, near what was labelled as the harbour, a building marked with a star and the word, Return. Below it, in the same careful handwriting from the photograph, For whoever comes. The door is unlocked. L. A stranger's hand-drawn map, given freely, no conditions, no trade, no negotiation. Just a woman, decades dead, leaving the door unlocked for people she would never meet because she believed they would eventually come. I held the map and felt something crack inside me. Not break, crack. The way ice cracks in spring, the way a seed cracks when it's ready. The flotilla buried column at sunset. Mora was there, which surprised me. She stood at the stern and watched the weighted canvas slip into the purple water, and I saw her lips move. Not words anyone could hear, but the shape of something that might have been an apology or might have been a prayer. The distinction didn't matter. What mattered was the movement, the acknowledgement that this man had existed and had come a long way to deliver something and had succeeded. After the burial, I went to my gap between the hulls and sat with the map and the photograph and tried to make a decision. Here's what I knew. The cache might still exist. Colm believed it did. The map suggested Lena had built it to last, but Colm hadn't verified it personally. He'd been given the map by someone who'd been given it by someone who'd known Lena. A chain of trust stretching across decades. Any link could be broken. Here's what else I knew. The flotilla was splitting. The lie had been exposed, and every day the reckoning went unresolved. The fracture widened. People were relocating between vessels, clustering with those who shared their position. The kelp harvest was falling behind. The fish catches were down because the trawler crews were arguing instead of working. The flotilla's survival depended on cooperation, and cooperation depended on a shared story. And the shared story was in pieces. And here's what I knew underneath all of that. In the place where knowledge lives before it becomes language, I had to choose. Not whether to go to shore. That was a question for the whole flotilla. A question that required consensus and planning and time. I had to choose something more immediate and more terrible. I had to choose what to say, because the flotilla was waiting for someone to stand up and declare what was real, and they were waiting for me. Not because I had authority. I was 17, I was mute, I was nobody's leader. They were waiting because I was Lena's daughter. Because the founding story, the real one, started with my mother and ended with me. Because the map was in my hands and the photograph was in my pocket, and the dead messenger had come for me, not for Mora, not for Oren, not for the flotilla, for me. And whatever I said, if I said anything at all, would become the new truth, not because it was true, but because they needed it to be. On the 9th day, I stood on the Grayling's main deck and looked at 60 faces. They were arranged in the way the flotilla always arranges itself for communal moments. Some sitting on coiled rope, some standing against the rails, some watching from the adjacent vessels through the gaps in the lashing. Mora was near the engine housing, in her spot. She looked older than she'd looked 10 days ago. Smaller. As if the exposure of the lie had physically reduced her. Oren was on the catamaran's rail, one hand on a stay line, his pale eyes steady. Fen was beside me, close enough that I could feel warmth from Fen's shoulder, not touching but present, in the way a wall is present when you lean near it. Dag stood at the front, near the bow, holding the waxboard and nail. My communication tools, offered to me like a microphone. I didn't take them. I opened my mouth. The sound that came out was not a word. Not at first, it was a vibration, a hum, a frequency my vocal cords produced almost experimentally, the way you'd test a rope before putting weight on it. I hadn't spoken in how long? 16 years. 17? Since infancy, since the sounds Colm had remembered, Mama. More. The last words I'd said before the silence swallowed me. Maura had always told me I stopped speaking on my own. A choice I made as a toddler, she said. Some children do. Some children decide that watching and listening is safer than contributing sound to a world already too loud with grief. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was another lie. It didn't matter now. My name, I said. My voice was terrible, rough, unpracticed. A tool that hadn't been used in almost 2 decades, like a hinge that's rusted open and screams when you try to move it. The words came out at the wrong volume. Too loud, then too soft, then too loud again. My body not knowing how to calibrate this instrument it had abandoned so long ago. People stared. Fenn's hand found my elbow, steadying. My name is Wren. I was born on a ship called the Meridian. My mother was Lena Vasquez. She built this flotilla. She planned for us to go home. The silence that followed was so absolute, I could hear the dead scraping at the waterline. That patient sound, that constant sound, the sound that had been the background music of my entire life. Maura kept us safe, I said. Oren kept us on course. They lied because they were afraid, and they were afraid because they loved us. And I am telling you this not because they were wrong, but because you deserve to know the shape of the life you're living. I was shaking. My whole body, like Colum, had shaken when they pulled him from the water. But I kept going because the voice, now that it was free, had a momentum of its own. Like a wave that's been building offshore for years and has finally reached the shallows. There's a cache in Astoria. My mother left it. Supplies, seeds, medicine, a way back to land. It might still be there. It might not. I have the map. I'm not going to tell you what to do with it. I paused, swallowed. My throat was on fire from the effort of using muscles that had essentially atrophied. I'm going to tell you what's true, and then you're going to decide. I told them. Everything. The Meridian, the founding, the plan, the return, the reason for the lie, the reason for breaking it. I told them about Colum, who he was, what he'd carried, what it cost him. I told them about the photograph and the map and the hand-drawn star marking a building where a dead woman had left the door unlocked. And then I said, I don't know if we should go. I don't know if the land is safe. I don't know if the cache survived. I don't know anything except this. My mother believed we could go back, and Maura believed we couldn't. And they were both operating on love and fear in different proportions, and neither of them was completely wrong. I looked at Maura. Her face was wet. I'd never seen Maura cry, not once in 17 years, and the sight of it was so disorienting that I almost stopped speaking. But she held my gaze and gave me the smallest nod. Not permission, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Go on. Finish it. Whatever we decide together. Not because of who my mother was. Not because of who Maura is. Because we're 61 people on the water, and the only thing keeping us alive is the decision to stay together. I stopped. Not because I was done, but because my voice gave out. Literally, physically, the muscles refusing, the sound cutting off like a radio losing signal. I stood there in the silence and felt the weight of what I'd done settle into my body. The vertigo of having spoken, of having chosen what was true, of having given 60 people a history they hadn't had that morning. Fenn's hand was still on my elbow. I leaned into it. Just slightly. Just enough. The vote took 3 days. Not a formal vote. The flotilla doesn't work that way. It was more like a tide, conversations flowing back and forth, positions shifting, people changing their minds and changing them back. Maura argued for staying on the water, and her argument was good. The ocean was known. The land was not. The dead on shore were still a threat, even if they'd degraded over decades. And the living settlements along the coast were unpredictable and sometimes hostile. Oren argued for a scouting mission, not a full migration, but a small crew in the catamaran, fast and light, to check Astoria and the cache. Dag argued for information before decision, which was the same as Oren's position, but with more medical contingencies attached. Fen argued for going. All of us, the whole flotilla, sailing to the coast and anchoring off Astoria and beginning the return, because, as Fen put it, we've been in the lifeboat for 40 years. At some point you have to trust that the drowning is over. I didn't argue for anything. I'd said what I had to say, and my voice was gone again, not by choice this time, but by physiology. My throat swelled and closed, and Dag gave me salt water to gargle and told me not to try speaking for at least a week. So I was back to my hands, back to the wax board, back to silence, but a different silence now. Before, my silence had been an absence, a thing about me that was missing. Now it felt like a choice, like a room I could enter and leave. On the 12th day after Colum's arrival, the 10th day of what I think of as the real story, the story that started when I saw my face in a dead man's photograph, the flotilla reached consensus. Not unanimity. Consensus. The distinction matters. Suki still didn't want to go to land. 3 of the older fishermen thought the whole thing was a trap, or a delusion, or both. A woman on one of the houseboats had panic attacks at the thought of being near shore, where the dead were thick. But the majority, the clear, undeniable majority, wanted to try. Oren plotted the course. Current position roughly 600 nautical miles off the Oregon coast, drifting north-northwest in the Pacific Loop. At the Grayling's best sustainable speed of 4 knots on biodiesel, with favorable currents, we could reach Astoria in approximately 8 days. Oren adjusted for current, weather patterns, fuel reserves. He checked and rechecked his calculations with the meticulous devotion of a man who'd been waiting 22 years to use a set of coordinates lodged in his skull. We began to sail east. The flotilla doesn't move fast. 11 vessels lashed together, even partially unlashed for transit, create an ungainly mass that the ocean treats more like a floating island than a ship. The Grayling provides propulsion. The catamaran ranges ahead, scouting. The other vessels are towed or drift in formation, connected by long lines that have to be constantly monitored for tension and wear. It's exhausting work. Everyone has a role. Mine was line management on the Grayling's stern. Adjusting the tow cables, checking the connections, making sure no vessel drifted too far or pulled too hard. It was good work. Physical. Absorbing. It let me think with my hands while my mind turned over the larger question, the one I hadn't resolved and couldn't resolve until we got there. What if the cash was gone? Because if it was, then everything I'd said on the Grayling's deck, the truth about the Meridian, the founding, the return, became a story with no ending, a door that led nowhere. I would have fractured the flotilla's lie and replaced it with a different kind of emptiness. Not the emptiness of not knowing, but the emptiness of knowing, and having nothing to show for it. Mora found me on the 3rd day of sailing. She came to the stern where I was working and stood beside me and said nothing for a long time. The coast was still invisible, days away, but there was something different about the air already, a faint terrestrial scent on the wind. Or maybe I was imagining it, the smell of land approaching, green things, soil, rot. "I'm sorry," Mora said. I looked at her. She was looking at the water behind us. At the wake, the Grayling left a white line dissolving into blue, temporary, gone. "Not for lying. I'd do that again. I'm sorry for not telling you who you are." I reached for my waxboard. "Scratched. You raised me. That's who I am." She read it and her face did the architectural thing again, but differently now. Not a wall shifting, but a wall coming down deliberately, brick by brick. "Your mother would have told you everything, from the day you could understand. She would have raised you with the plan, with the purpose, with the whole damn map tattooed on your psyche. She was like that, all forward motion, all future. A pause. I was the one who looked back, who held on, who kept things the way they were because changing them felt like losing her again. I put my hand on her arm, the same gesture Fen used on me. Warmth, presence, the vocabulary of touch that works when signs and words run out. If the cash is there, Mora said, if it's real, if we can go ashore. I don't know how to live on land, Ren. I've been on this water for 23 years. The grayling is my ground, these decks are my dirt. I wrote, then we'll learn, same way we learned the water. She read it. She almost smiled. You sound like her, she said again, but this time it wasn't an accusation. It was a recognition, and it was enough. We raised the coast on the 18th day. I was on the grayling's bow when it appeared, the dark line on the horizon, so faint it could have been a cloud bank or a trick of the light, except that it didn't move. It stayed. It solidified. It grew over hours into shape. Hills, green with what I would later learn was second-growth forest. Douglas fir and Sitka spruce gone wild and thick over the ruins of whatever the old world had been. The mouth of the Columbia River, wide and grey-brown, pushing fresh water into the salt ocean in a visible line where the colours changed. I gripped the rail and stared and felt the deck under my feet and thought, this is what my mother saw. When she left, when she planned all of this. She stood at this angle and looked at this coastline and decided to go, and decided to come back. The dead were there. We could see them on the shore as we approached. Figures on the beach moving with the slow, degraded patience of bodies that had been walking for nearly 4 decades. Most were barely functional, skeletal, weathered, missing limbs, dragging themselves more than walking. Some had stopped moving altogether, sitting or lying in the sand like driftwood with eyes. The ocean dead floated near the river mouth in clusters, carried by the current, too waterlogged to be a real threat, but present enough to require navigation. Oren guided the catamaran through them with the calm focus of a man threading a needle, calling course corrections back to the grayling by voice. We anchored a 1/4 mile offshore, close enough to reach land by dinghy, far enough to run if we needed to. The scouting party was 5. Me, Fen, Dag, Oren, and a fisherman named Cade who'd been the most vocal advocate for the return, and who also happened to be the best hand with the gaff poles we used as weapons. We took the grayling's dinghy, a 12-foot aluminum skiff with oars, no motor, because the motor had died 2 years ago, and we'd never been near a shore to scavenge parts. Mora stayed on the grayling. She stood at the rail and watched us go, and her face was the face of a woman watching something leave that she wasn't sure would come back. I signed to her from the dinghy, "I'll come back." She signed back, "You better." The beach was the strangest thing I'd ever touched. Sand under my feet. Not deck, not metal, not wood, but millions of tiny fragments of rock and shell that shifted and gave and didn't sway with the rhythm of the water. I stood on it and felt dizzy, seasick in reverse, my body so accustomed to the flotilla's motion that stillness felt like a disturbance. Fen grabbed my arm. "Ground legs," Fen said. "Oren warned me, takes a few minutes." The dead on the beach were no more dangerous than the ones we drifted past on the flotilla. Less, maybe. These had been exposed to weather for decades. Sun, rain, freeze, thaw, and were so degraded that some collapsed when they tried to stand. Cade dealt with the 2 that approached us, quick and efficient with the gaff, and we moved inland. Astoria was a ruin and a garden simultaneously. The buildings were coming apart. Roofs caved in, walls slumped, streets split by tree roots and overgrown with blackberry so thick it formed tunnels. But the green was overwhelming. Everywhere, violent, extravagant, reckless green. Life had not waited for permission. It had moved back into the spaces the dead had vacated and filled them with such intensity that walking through the streets felt like walking through a throat that was trying to swallow us, gently, into something living. The harbour pilot's office was where the map said it would be. A concrete building, low and square, half swallowed by ivy, but the walls intact. The door was steel. It was unlocked, as promised. The handle turned and the hinges screamed, and we stepped into the dark, and Dag lit the oil lantern we'd brought, and the light fell on rows. Rows and rows and rows. Shelving floor to ceiling. Sealed containers. Plastic tubs with gaskets labelled in that same careful handwriting. Seeds, medical supplies, tools, water purification tablets, a hand-crank radio, solar panels disassembled and wrapped in oilcloth, books, agricultural manuals, medical references, engineering guides, a sealed envelope on the front shelf, addressed to no one, containing a letter I would read later that began, "If you're reading this." The lifeboat reached shore. "Welcome home." Fen made a sound. Not grief this time. Something else. Wonder maybe, or belief confirmed. The sound of someone who argued for a door and found it open. Dag moved through the shelves with focused intensity, checking seals, reading labels, mentally inventorying. "The antibiotics are expired," Dag said after 20 minutes, "but the surgical supplies are sterile sealed and likely viable. Seeds will need germination testing. The solar panels..." Dag turned to me. "This is real. This is enough." I stood in the center of my mother's cache and held her letter and felt the weight of what she'd done. Not just the supplies, not just the plan, but the act of faith embedded in every sealed container, every labeled shelf. She had believed, with the ferocity of someone who knew she wouldn't live to see it, that the people she loved would eventually come through this door. And we had. 22 years late, carrying the ashes of a lie, led by the daughter she'd put in a bait cooler and set adrift. But we had come. That night, back on the flotilla, I stood on the Grayling's bow and looked at the coast. The green hills, the river mouth, the dark shape of Astoria under the stars. Below me, the dead bumped against the hull in their patient way. Above me, the sky was clear, and the stars were the same ones I'd looked at from the catamaran's deck with Fen, from the gap between the hulls, from every vantage point on the only home I'd known. Behind me, I could hear the flotilla. Voices, movement, the sounds of 61 people processing the news that the cache was real, that land was possible, that the story was changing again. I could hear Maura in the engine room, doing something mechanical, the clang of a wrench, the steady rhythm of a woman who works to keep from flying apart. I could hear Dag reporting findings to a cluster of listeners. I could hear Fen somewhere, laughing at something someone said, that warm, unexpected sound that cut through salt air like a bell. I looked at the photograph one more time. The baby, the arms, the jaw, the green through the window, this shore, this green. My mother had held me at this angle, and someone had taken this picture, and she had been looking at this same coastline, this same river, this same impossible future. From somewhere on the flotilla, carried on the night wind, I heard a sound I didn't recognize for a moment. A baby crying. Not mine, not me, but Suki's child, born that evening in the catamaran's cabin, while the rest of us were counting seeds in a dead woman's warehouse. A girl, Fen told me later. Suki hadn't named her yet. I put my hand on the rail and felt the metal and the motion and the cold, and I thought, she'll learn the ground. Not the way I'm learning it, with sea legs and vertigo and the memory of decks. She'll learn it first. The dirt, the grass, the feeling of something solid that doesn't move. She'll be the first one of us for whom land is not a story, but a starting place. And she'll owe nothing to the meridian, or the lie, or the map, or the letter, or the photograph. She'll be new, The first truly new thing on the water in 40 years. I stood there until the stars shifted, and the baby quieted and the dead drifted past in the current, absorbed by the river, carried out to sea, replaced by others, replaced by nothing. The water taking what it takes, giving back what it gives. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel right. I felt the vertigo of authorship, the dizziness of having stood in front of 60 people and chosen which version of the world to hand them, knowing they'd carry it forward, knowing it would become the new foundation, knowing that I'd built it from truth and guesswork and a dead stranger's testimony and a mother I'd never met. The weight of it was extraordinary. Not heavy like grief, heavy like responsibility, like being the person who says this is what happened and watches it become real because you said it. My throat ached. My hands were salt-cracked and raw from the toe lines. My feet, bare on the cold deck, registered every rivet, every seam, every imperfection in the steel that had held me above the water for 17 years. I turned from the rail and went to find Fen, not to say anything, not to sign anything, just to sit beside someone and be quiet in a way that meant something, the way silence means something when you've broken it once and chosen to return to it. The flotilla rocked, the coast held, the baby slept. Morning would come, and with it, everything. I wrote this story because I've been thinking about the lies we build communities on. Not malicious lies necessarily, but the simplifications and omissions that become load-bearing walls in the structures of our shared identity. Every family has a founding story. Every town, every nation, every group of people who've decided to stay together has a version of the past that's been edited for cohesion. And most of the time, that editing is done by people who love us and are terrified of what the full truth might cost. The question that kept pulling me forward was, what happens when truth and stability can't coexist? When the honest version of the story is also the one that fractures the group? We tend to frame truth-telling as inherently heroic, but Wren's choice isn't simple heroism. She's 17, she's making a decision that will reshape the lives of 60 people, and she has no guarantee she's right. That felt real to me. That felt like the kind of decision most of us face in smaller ways. In families, in relationships, in the quiet moments where we decide whether to say the thing that changes everything. The dead in this story are background. I wanted them to be. Ambient, environmental, the weather of a world that's moved past panic into something more like coexistence with horror. The real threat was never the dead. It was the distance between what people know and what they've agreed to pretend. 3 questions I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on. First, the cache had been sitting there for over 2 decades. What's the realistic shelf life of sealed seeds and medical supplies in a concrete building in coastal Oregon? Would any of it actually be usable? Second, was Maura right to bury the truth? She kept 61 people alive for 20 years on a lie. Does the outcome justify the method? And third, if you'd been Wren on that deck, and you knew the flotilla would believe whatever you said, and the man who could have confirmed the truth was already dead, would you have spoken? Or would you have stayed silent and let the old story hold? Thank you for listening this far. I don't take that lightly.